Tonight, we begin with the island of Trinidad and Tobago, a jewel nestled in the Caribbean, where the whispers of history swirl on the warm breeze that brushes the shores. Imagine walking along the coast, the soft waves lapping at your feet as you hear the distant hum of tropical birds. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The story of Trinidad and Tobago's journey to independence begins with their arrival as small, distant pieces on the map for the European powers of the 16th century. The islands, originally home to the peaceful Arawak and Carib peoples, were first discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1498, who named them in honor of the Holy Trinity. The colonial powers, first the Spanish and later the British, sought to claim these islands for their wealth and strategic location, though it took several centuries for the full colonial experience to embed itself in the islands. You can imagine the early days of the British presence with sugarcane and rum plantations being established across the islands, gradually altering the landscape both literally and figuratively. In 1797, the British took control of Trinidad, followed by Tobago in 1814. With these acquisitions, the stage was set for the creation of a plantation economy that would rely heavily on enslaved labor from Africa. The history of Trinidad and Tobago as a colony was in many ways the history of these plantations whose wealth would drive the island's economy for centuries. It wasn't just a simple story of conquest and control. It was one of exploitation of human lives shaped by the forces of colonialism. The British, of course, brought with them a complex system of governance. The colonial powers didn't just build plantations, they built the very foundation of the government that would govern these islands for nearly 2 centuries. But as we now know, control of these islands wasn't easily maintained. The rich history of resistance uprisings and rebellion simmered just below the surface. Historians still argue whether the British ever truly grasped the full scale of the simmering discontent on the islands. But as you rest here, you might wonder how long it takes before the people say, enough is enough. As you settle deeper into your bed, imagine the heat of the sun on your face as you walk through the sugar fields, feeling the humidity press against your skin. The rhythmic rustling of sugar cane in the wind feels almost like a lullaby now. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, this landscape was full of tension. Sugar, once a luxury of the wealthy, became the engine driving the island's economy, fueling the colonial powers' interests. But this prosperity came at a great cost, one that still echoes in the history of the island today. By the time the British took full control of Trinidad in 1797, sugar had already become king. With its growth came the brutal need for labor. The British brought enslaved Africans who were forced to work the fields under the harshest conditions, cultivating sugar and producing rum, a trade that shaped the Caribbean's entire economy. The tropical sun beat down on them, the endless rows of sugarcane stretching as far as the eye could see, with no sign of relief. Picture the days and nights merging together as laborers worked tirelessly, the air thick with sweat, the ground pressed into the rhythm of their work. But even in the depths of such harsh labor, there was always the glimmer of hope, the dream of freedom. It wasn't just the enslaved Africans who toiled in the sugar fields. Indigenous peoples too played a role in the early history of Trinidad and Tobago, though they were soon displaced by the waves of colonizers. Yet the legacy of these indigenous groups remains a part of the island's cultural fabric, even if their presence was systematically erased in many ways. As the sugar plantations flourished, so did the society built upon their foundations, one that was deeply divided along racial and class lines. In the late 19th century, a pivotal shift took place. As the abolition of slavery swept through the British Empire in 1834, the former enslaved laborers found themselves replaced by indentured laborers from India. These workers, many of whom had been brought to Trinidad to continue the labor in the sugar fields, brought with them a culture that would forever change the islands. Indian indentured workers, along with African descendants, began to form the complex social structure that would characterize Trinidad and Tobago's population for years to come. Historians still argue over whether the introduction of indentured laborers helped unite the population or simply further divided it, creating ethnic tensions that persist today. But regardless of the debate, it's clear that the social dynamics of the islands were forever altered by the ebb and flow of different peoples coming to the shores. You may even hear echoes of the past in the sounds around you, as the whispers of those who came before you seem to speak in unison. Could it be the sound of a Caribbean breeze? Or perhaps it's the reminder of those who labored, fought, and resisted colonial oppression for the hope of a brighter future. As the night deepens and the gentle rustling of trees outside grows softer, picture the waves crashing against the shore, carrying with them stories of resistance. Resistance was in the very air of Trinidad and Tobago, long before independence, a simmering spirit that would not be easily squashed. Enslaved Africans, indentured laborers, and even the indigenous peoples of the islands found themselves in constant battle for their rights, their dignity, and their freedom. And it wasn't just an abstract fight, it was one that was physical, emotional, and cultural, a constant push against the weight of colonial control. Imagine for a moment the intensity of the revolt of 1816 when enslaved Africans in Trinidad rose up in rebellion. The authorities swiftly quelled it, but the desire for freedom wasn't easily extinguished. The people of the islands had tasted what it was like to dream of a life without the crushing grip of colonizers, and that dream began to take root in the hearts of many. The sugar plantations, once the symbol of wealth and colonial power, began to echo with the cries of resistance. These revolts would not be the last. The island was a simmering pot of unrest, a place where defiance was written into the very soil. But there were many more silent, insidious acts of resistance that may have gone unnoticed by the British. The enslaved Africans didn't just rise up in violent protests. They fought back in subtler ways through their culture, their music, their language, and their spiritual practices. They found ways to carve out small pieces of freedom within the confines of slavery, and in doing so they created a rich cultural tapestry that would define Trinidad and Tobago for generations to come. Picture the sounds of calypso music born from this resilience, a genre that would later become a symbol of the island's identity. It wasn't just about what they were fighting against, it was also about what they were creating in the process. The era of rebellion and unrest was punctuated by the constant push for freedom. Despite the oppressive weight of colonialism, voices like those of leaders such as Arthur Andrew Cipriani emerged in the early 20th century. Cipriani, a key figure in the labor movement, played a crucial role in advocating for the rights of workers, helping to shift the power dynamics of the island. As the British Empire continued to crumble in the face of global shifts, figures like Cipriani were the architects of change, pushing for reforms that would eventually lead to greater political freedoms. Historians still argue whether the labor revolts and strikes of the early 20th century were truly the driving force behind independence, or if it was merely a part of the larger wave of decolonization that swept the world in the wake of World War II. Was it the labor movements that set the stage for the push for independence, or was it the result of a broader global context where colonial powers were finally ready to give up their empires? There's no clear answer, but what's undeniable is the powerful role the people of Trinidad and Tobago played in shaping their own destiny. So as you drift deeper into sleep, think about how history isn't just shaped by grand speeches or declarations, it's also shaped by the quiet, everyday resistance of ordinary people. The voices of those who resisted, fought, and survived will forever reverberate across these islands. As you slip further into the tranquility of the night, picture yourself walking through the streets of Port of Spain in the early 20th century when the air is thick with anticipation. The world is changing, and so is Trinidad and Tobago. The rumblings of political change start to reach your ears, filling the air with a sense of restless hope. For decades, the islands had endured under British colonial rule, but the winds of change were beginning to blow stronger. and they could no longer be ignored. The call for self-governance had begun. By the 1930s and 1940s, the islands had become a hotbed of political activity. The labor strikes, fueled by a growing sense of discontent among the working classes, had become more frequent and intense. The sugar and oil industries, which had once been the backbone of Trinidad and Tobago's economy, were now embroiled in struggles that reflected the broader desire for a more just society. Amidst this climate of unrest, the question on everyone's mind was clear: what would it take for Trinidad and Tobago to gain full self-governance? One of the pivotal moments in this struggle came in 1944, when the British agreed to hold a constitutional commission in response to the growing demands for reform. This was a momentous shift. The British, who had long been resistant to change, were now beginning to recognize that their hold on the islands was weakening. It was as though the islanders had found their voice, and the colonial powers could no longer silence it. At the forefront of these efforts were individuals like Eric Williams, who would later become the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Williams, a trained historian, recognized that the key to gaining independence lay in the islanders' ability to unite around a shared vision. His work and his words galvanized the masses, shifting the focus from isolated labor strikes to a broader political movement that sought full autonomy. But it wasn't just Williams. A diverse range of leaders from different backgrounds and political persuasions began to push for a more democratic system of government, one that would serve the people rather than the colonial rulers. Historians still debate whether the British decision to move towards self-government was a result of local pressure or a sign of their larger retreat from empire. Was the British Empire in decline, or was Trinidad and Tobago merely catching the wave of global decolonization? There's no easy answer, but what is certain is that the road to self-governance had been paved by years of struggle, protest, and political maneuvering. As you settle into your thoughts, reflect on the power of a collective vision. What started as small acts of rebellion on sugar plantations turned into a widespread political movement that would change the course of the island's future forever. In these dark hours of history, change was on the horizon, and it would soon sweep over the islands in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. The gentle sway of the trees outside your window mirrors the gradual shift in the political landscape of Trinidad and Tobago in the mid-20th century. As the islands began their journey toward independence, the leaders of the movement became as crucial to the narrative as the people who had fought for change. Among them, one name stands out like a beacon: Eric Williams. Picture him now standing before a crowd of passionate supporters, his voice carrying the weight of history as he speaks of the need for self-rule and a nation built by its people for its people. Williams wasn't just a politician, he was a visionary, a historian who saw the colonial chains and understood that breaking free required not just political change, but a radical reimagining of the island's identity. Williams's rise to prominence in the 1950s marked a turning point. After years of being involved in the political life of Trinidad and Tobago, he became the voice of the people in a way that no one else had before. In 1956, he formed the People's National Movement (PNM), which would go on to lead the country to independence. His message was simple, yet powerful. The islands deserved their own destiny, their own place in the world. But it wasn't just about freedom from colonial rule. It was about the reshaping of society, about creating an economy that would benefit all, not just the elites who had long controlled the wealth. In tandem with Williams's rise, another figure of great importance emerged: Arthur Andrew Cipriani. Cipriani, a labor leader and activist, had been at the forefront of the fight for workers' rights for years, long before Williams became the face of political independence. While Williams fought for national sovereignty, Cipriani fought for the rights of the working class who had been oppressed under the colonial system. Their collaboration became a crucial part of the movement towards self-rule, with each of their efforts complementing the other. Williams's vision for a new nation was gradually taking shape, but it wasn't a smooth path. Historians still debate the extent to which the rise of leaders like Williams and Cipriani shaped the momentum for independence, or whether it was the broader socio-political forces at play that pushed Trinidad and Tobago toward self-rule. Was it these charismatic leaders who made the difference? Or were they merely reflecting the desires of a population that had already decided its time had come? The question remains, though one thing is certain. The leadership of Williams and Cipriani was instrumental in galvanizing the people and making independence a real possibility. As you listen to the soft hum of the world outside, imagine the energy of the crowd at a political rally, their cheers and chants rising up in unison. This was a moment of collective empowerment, one that would set the stage for a new era in Trinidad and Tobago's history. The night feels cooler now, the calm broken only by the rhythmic sound of crickets outside. The world is shifting, and in Trinidad and Tobago, the second half of the 20th century is marked by one of the most pivotal events of all World War II. The global conflict, which had altered the fates of nations across the world, would also prove to be a catalyst for change in the Caribbean. As the war raged in Europe, the British Empire found itself stretched thin, managing its colonies while simultaneously fighting to hold its empire together. The people of Trinidad and Tobago, meanwhile, felt the growing pressure of these global changes in a very personal way. Imagine, if you will, the streets of Port of Spain bustling with wartime activity. British soldiers patrolled the islands, strategic ports were bustling with supplies, and the local population found themselves deeply intertwined with the war effort. But even as the islanders contributed to the British cause, there was a quiet undercurrent of resentment building. The people of Trinidad and Tobago had long been contributing to the empire's wealth, whether through sugar oil or labor. Yet they were still governed by a colonial power that offered them few privileges or recognition in return. The war created a moment where the colonial relationship seemed increasingly untenable. The economic changes wrought by the war were significant. Trinidad, rich in oil, became an important site for oil production, and its economic importance grew exponentially. This brought increased wealth and infrastructure development, but it also underscored the inequality at the heart of the colonial system. As the war wound down and the British Empire began to recede, Trinidad and Tobago's economy became more tightly linked to global markets, and the island's growing wealth made its political subjugation more and more absurd. During this period, political activism surged, the population, largely motivated by a sense of injustice and a desire for greater self-determination, began to press harder for self-rule. But it wasn't just a matter of economic pressure. There was something deeper stirring in the hearts of the people. The war had shown them what they could do when they came together, and now they saw that they had the potential to shape their own future. As soldiers returned from the battlefield and workers continued to push for better wages and rights, the message became clear: Trinidad and Tobago was ready for its independence. Historians still debate whether World War II played a central role in speeding up the decolonization process in the Caribbean, or whether it was merely a backdrop for the wider global wave of independence movements. Did the economic growth from oil and the rise of nationalism make independence inevitable, or did the war truly provide the spark that ignited the flame? What is clear, however, is that the geopolitical changes following the war made it increasingly difficult for Britain to maintain control over its colonies. For Trinidad and Tobago, it was now only a matter of time. As you settle deeper into your thoughts, think about how these global events resonated on a personal level for those living on the islands. It was no longer just about the distant struggle of a far-off war. It was about shaping the future of their own homeland, a future that they were more than ready to take into their own hands. As the night settles into a deeper calm, the sound of the world outside fades, and you're left with the echo of a country on the cusp of transformation. The late 1950s and early 1960s marked a critical period of change for Trinidad and Tobago, one that would push them ever closer to independence. The British Empire, once vast and unyielding, was beginning to loosen its grip on colonies all over the world. In the Caribbean, the islands were increasingly vocal in their demands for self-governance. But the road to independence was far from straightforward. It was filled with negotiations, discussions, and quiet moments of tension as both local leaders and the British government weighed their options. The British, after all, were not in a rush to relinquish their hold. But the world was changing, and by the late 1950s, the winds of decolonization had picked up momentum. The United Nations had begun to advocate for self-determination, and the British government was increasingly finding it difficult to maintain control over distant territories. The Caribbean was no exception. Trinidad and Tobago's growing political movements were echoing the sentiments of other Caribbean islands, and as the cries for independence grew louder, Britain had to listen. In 1956, following a series of strikes, uprisings, and political movements, the British government reluctantly agreed to grant greater autonomy to the island. The following year, a new constitution was introduced that allowed for a fully elected legislative council. For the first time, the people of Trinidad and Tobago were given a real say in their future. This shift wasn't just political, it was deeply cultural. It marked the beginning of the end for British rule, even though it would take several more years before the final break. Enter Eric Williams, who by this time had become the face of the independence movement. His People's National Movement (PNM) was gaining ground not only politically, but also symbolically. Williams had long advocated for the importance of history and culture in shaping a nation, and he saw independence not just as a political necessity but as a cultural renaissance. Under his leadership, the PNM emerged as the dominant political force in the country, pushing the island toward a future of self-determination. But it wasn't just Williams pushing for change. The role of other political figures, those who had been agitating for decades like Cipriani, was critical. The intersection of labor rights and political independence was a defining feature of the era, and the eventual success of the PNM in securing greater autonomy in the late 1950s was a testament to the power of these political alliances. Historians still argue whether the British were more inclined to grant self-rule due to internal British pressures or because of the growing political movements on the islands themselves. Was Britain simply conceding to a changing global order, or was the drive for independence truly spearheaded by the people of Trinidad and Tobago? No one can say for sure, but one thing is clear: the events of the late 1950s set the stage for what would come next. As you drift deeper into your thoughts, consider the weight of the negotiations that took place behind closed doors, the subtle shifts in power, the behind-the-scenes efforts, and the quiet determination of leaders and activists all contributed to the realization that Trinidad and Tobago was no longer just a colony, it was a nation preparing for its rightful place on the global stage. As the night deepens, a sense of inevitability starts to settle in, much like the inevitable independence that Trinidad and Tobago was hurtling toward. The years leading up to 1962 were a time of political tension and increasing anticipation. The groundwork had been laid. Discussions, debates, and slow, painful negotiations between the British and local political leaders had set the stage for the grand finale, the formal Declaration of Independence. The people of Trinidad and Tobago had fought for it, dreamed of it, and now they stood on the brink of freedom. August 31st, 1962 marked that date. It's a moment that echoes with the triumph of a nation. Independence was granted, and Trinidad and Tobago became the first country in the English-speaking Caribbean to break free from British colonial rule. But even as the Union Jack was lowered, the reality of what lay ahead was complex. Independence, after all, is not a singular event. It's the culmination of a long, often messy process, one that is shaped by the challenges that follow. Picture yourself there on that momentous day, standing in the crowds as the flag is lowered and the new national flag is raised. There's an overwhelming sense of hope, relief, and pride in the air. People cheered, waved flags, and celebrated the long-fought victory. But there was also an unspoken understanding that the road ahead would not be without its hurdles. Independence doesn't automatically solve everything. It merely opens the door to a new chapter 1 that requires its own set of decisions, challenges, and growth. Williams, who had been the intellectual and political force behind much of the movement for independence, now had to step into the role of leading a newly sovereign nation. And while the excitement of independence couldn't be denied, the reality was that Trinidad and Tobago, like many newly independent countries, was facing a landscape of political, economic, and social complexities. The people had fought for freedom, but now it was time to build a nation. There were questions that loomed large. How would the new government address the deeply ingrained social and economic inequalities that existed on the island? How would it forge a national identity that respected the diverse cultural backgrounds of its people, from the descendants of African slaves to the indentured Indian laborers and the indigenous populations? And perhaps most importantly, how would Trinidad and Tobago navigate its newfound sovereignty in a world that was rapidly changing? Historians still debate whether the British had any lingering hope of holding on to their former colonies in the Caribbean, or whether the islands were always destined to seek full independence. What is clear, however, is that the decision in 1962 to grant independence to Trinidad and Tobago was a significant step in the larger decolonization process across the Caribbean and the world. The weight of history hung in the air that day, a testament to the resilience and determination of the people who had worked for generations to bring about this moment. As you let that moment settle in, picture the excitement, the uncertainty, and the cautious optimism that filled the hearts of the people. Independence was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new and uncertain journey. As the quiet night deepens, the weight of what has come before settles around you, and now, in the stillness, imagine the first few years of independence, how they were filled with promise, yes, but also challenge. Trinidad and Tobago had shaken off its colonial chains, but what came next was not a smooth ride into the future. The islands now faced the daunting task of forging a national identity, a sense of unity, and a path forward for their people. The challenges were many, and the shadows of colonialism loomed large even in this new chapter. The economic disparities that had long existed under British rule didn't disappear overnight. Though the oil industry provided a boost to the economy, poverty and inequality were still deeply entrenched in society. The legacy of the colonial economy, built on exploitation and social stratification, wasn't something that could be wiped away with the stroke of a pen. Despite the bright promises of independence, the gap between the wealthy and the working class remained vast. Racial divisions, too, had been entrenched during colonial rule, and though the people of Trinidad and Tobago were united in their desire for independence, they were still grappling with issues of race and ethnicity, which were now compounded by the complexities of nation-building. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister, was left to grapple with these pressing issues. He had long championed the idea of a united Trinidad and Tobago, but his vision for the nation was far from universally embraced. Williams faced criticism for his handling of the economy and for his attempts to navigate the tricky waters of racial and cultural unity. While many saw him as a symbol of hope, others questioned whether his leadership could truly bridge the divides that existed in the society. One of the biggest challenges faced by the newly independent nation was ensuring political stability. It's easy to imagine the unease, the backroom political maneuvering, and the weight of knowing that the stability of the entire country rested on the shoulders of a few individuals. As a new government took shape, the deep divides between the political elite and the everyday people began to widen. The democratic ideals that Williams had fought so hard to establish were now at risk, and it was a delicate balance to keep the country's fledgling institutions from being overwhelmed by the challenges it faced. Historians still debate whether the early years of Trinidad and Tobago's independence were shaped more by the country's internal struggles or by the pressures of the larger world around it. Could the nation have done more to address the socio-economic disparities and racial tensions in those early years, or were these problems simply a reflection of the larger issues facing newly independent nations in the post-colonial world? Whatever the case may be, the truth is that the road to nationhood was never going to be simple, and for Trinidad and Tobago, it was a road filled with bumps, setbacks, and difficult decisions. But even in the face of these challenges, the people of Trinidad and Tobago continued to press on, continuing to shape the future of their country. The early years of independence were just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, much healing needed. But perhaps that is the story of every newly independent nation. The moment of freedom is the beginning of a much longer journey. As you drift into a more peaceful rest, think of the road that these islanders walked in the early years of their nationhood. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always smooth, but it was their road to carve, and they carved it together. The calm of the night feels deeper now, and as you relax into the quiet, think about Trinidad and Tobago today. The islands have come a long way since that monumental moment in 1962. The transition from a colonial outpost to an independent nation was not easy, and the echoes of colonialism still resonate in some corners of the nation's identity. But the journey of these islands is also a story of resilience, reinvention, and slow, steady progress. The complex tapestry of Trinidad and Tobago is one woven together by a shared history of struggle, survival, and the continuous pursuit of freedom. Today, as you walk through the streets of Port of Spain or breathe in the air on the shores of Tobago, the scars of colonialism are still visible. The remnants of past divisions, racial, economic, and political, are there woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet so too is the strength of a people who have defied the odds and built a nation from the ashes of their colonial past. The steel pan calypso and soca music that fill the air are more than just cultural expressions. They are the heartbeat of a nation that refuses to be defined solely by its history of exploitation. These symbols of resistance and pride tell the world that Trinidad and Tobago has made it through the storm, and though the struggle continues, it does so with a spirit of determination and joy. But even as you feel the pulse of this vibrant country, the question remains, can a nation ever fully heal from the deep scars of its colonial past? Historians and sociologists still debate whether nations like Trinidad and Tobago can ever escape the long shadows of their colonial legacies. Can a country truly be free of the economic and social systems that were built to maintain the power of its colonizers? The debate is ongoing, but one thing is certain: Trinidad and Tobago, like many former colonies, continues to strive toward a future of greater equality, self-determination, and unity. The struggle for independence was just the beginning, and while there has been progress, challenges remain. The nation still faces political tensions, economic disparities, and issues of social justice, but these are no longer the struggles of a people under the boot of colonial rule. Instead, they are the struggles of a sovereign nation trying to carve out its place in a world that is ever-changing. As you let the peaceful rhythm of the evening wash over you, think of how far Trinidad and Tobago has come and how far it still has to go. The path of independence, though long and difficult, has given the people of this nation the tools to navigate their future. And in that quiet, reflective space, as you breathe deeply and relax further into the night, know that the island's journey is one of hope, perseverance, and the ever-present pull of progress. The colonial legacy may never fully disappear, but the people of Trinidad and Tobago are writing their own story, now a story that continues to evolve with each new generation.